let's talk a little bit about your book, The Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, and your philosophy behind that and what you do.
So, one of the ways that I like to explain the work that I do is to just introduce people to, in many ways, what is a fairly obvious dichotomy, yet it's one that we don't pay a lot of attention to. And what that is that when you think of men and you think of how men have been raised, how we've been socialized to be men, there are rules around that socialization process. And those rules tend to be fairly rigid. It's changing with generations, but they're still there, and they're still very strong. And the rules like, don't ask for help, don't be vulnerable, don't cry, don't show emotions, be strong, be the provider, fix everything, know everything, be sexually super competent, aggressive, and successful, be powerful. The list could go on. Mm-hmm. So you have that dichotomy, those rules. That's the first half of the dichotomy. Then you expose men to couples therapy, to things like Al-Anon or Nar-Anon, or to treatment, or to anything like that. And what do we tell men to start doing? Well, we tell them to be vulnerable, share their feelings, to cry, to get in touch with, trusting others, to let go of power and control, and to ask for help, and to acknowledge that they don't know everything. And so there's an inherent contradiction in how men have worked to prove and be who they are compared to who we're asking them to be in ways of being and living that we're asking them to adopt through the treatment and recovery process. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The reason that's important is because we almost never acknowledge that. And when we don't acknowledge that, then we can't speak directly to men's experience about how challenging it can be. Those rules are so deeply rooted inside of us, they don't go away. I've got 18 years of, I think, quite high-quality recovery, and I deal with those rules on a daily basis in my relationship with my wife, in my relationship with my daughter, and in all of the interactions I have in my business world. So to not acknowledge that dichotomy, but more importantly, to not build services and a paradigm based on that dichotomy and understanding it really is counterproductive and certainly limits how effective we can be with men. But the other thing that's important about it is that what I found through my book, through my master's research, and through the work I continue to do is that when we don't call out the rules overtly to men, they tend to operate with those rules as if they're real, in the sense that they think that that's just how men are. They think that that's just who they are. They don't detach from them and see them as ways that they've been told they have to live, that they can choose or not choose.
Right.
And some people would argue, against me for this, but the thing is the proof I have in men being able to make these choices is in the 18 years of recovery that I've got and watching all the men, including myself, and how much we grow through the process of recovery. But when we're not aware of the rules, the rules can continue to have very significant impact on us. And that's what leads a lot of men in recovery to struggle with anger, domestic violence, relationships, sexual acting out or any kind of sexual understanding for themselves, for others, objectification of women, detached fathering, homophobia. All of those sorts of things operate at fairly clandestine levels throughout the recovery community, and men and women, but men especially, are complicit in not directly confronting that systemically. It can happen to, in pockets with men and maybe their sponsees or their working relationships, or maybe a certain treatment program will look at some of that, or there's a men's meeting. But on the whole, It seems to be more by happenstance that a man is exposed to those ideas.
I have a question for you. I'm interested myself in this. In your description of your book, you say that it is the first trauma-informed book to take a holistic look at men's sobriety. Can you define a holistic look at men's sobriety, please?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So trauma is really changing the game of services, period. Mental health, addiction, in schools. I mean, when we think of trauma, when we begin to understand trauma, as we begin to understand trauma and treat it as it shows up, we see how pervasive it is. It happens on a continuum, but it's incredibly pervasive. Mm-hmm. So what it means for my book to be trauma-informed is that as I wrote that book, trauma was constantly on my mind, and I was constantly thinking about the wording, the interpretations, and even some of the insights that I was sharing from the context of trauma and how to help men really talk about trauma. The thing about trauma also is that the dominant model for treating trauma is really a feminine model. And what I mean by that is that for the last 30 years when we've talked about trauma, primarily we've talked about it in the context of women and children. Now, we have talked about trauma, PTSD for veterans, right, but that tends to be separate and not seen as part of the same continuum. And that is pretty much what men are relegated to experiencing as far as trauma, which we know is completely false. You know, men, boys who grow up being abused are similar to girls who grow up being abused as far as experiencing the trauma, but we just have done a very poor job of recognizing that. So that's one piece of it, but the holistic piece is, again, this whole idea of male socialization. What does it really mean for a man to have to talk about sex and sexuality? You know, how do men experience sex? What does it mean for a man to work step 3 from the perspective of turning his will and life over and letting go of control? You know, what does it mean for a man to do that? What does it mean for a man to, you know, who's constantly being told that power is one of the greatest ways of affirming his manhood, you know, that he's powerless? And how does that affect, you know, not only the interpretation of a powerlessness over alcohol and other drugs, but further experiences of powerlessness? You know, the other holistic aspect of it, I would say, is that I really sought to bring in as many ideas as I could while relating them to the 12 steps. So there's a chapter on grief. There's a chapter about fathers. There's a chapter about codependency. There's a chapter about just, you know, feelings. There's even a chapter about how do we deal with the idea of difference. In step 1, I talk about privilege and entitlement and how that affects our relationships of power. So it's, you know, it's along those lines that how I consider it, why I consider it, and why others actually consider it to be holistic.
Do you believe that, and what you see, that the majority of people who become addicted to, let's just say, substance abuse and alcoholism, not the process addictions at the moment, but do you believe that the majority of them they've done this because of a result of trauma? It seems like well,
there's no question that there's a connection. I mean, there's absolutely no the more we're learning about trauma, the more we're realizing how trauma, where it's located in the brain, how much the neurotransmitters and the place in the brain where trauma resides is so similar to the mechanisms for addiction. And as we talk more honestly about trauma, just how many men and women who suffer from alcohol and other drug addictions, how many of them have experienced trauma. So there's absolutely a very direct connection. Now, what I would also say is that, and I think this is an unintentional thing, but I think it happens, and that is we focus on the person with the addiction and their trauma, and we forget or we don't look at the trauma of the family system. And one of the greatest things a family can do is really look at itself as honestly as it can. I mean, the majority of young people in treatment are the scapegoats of the unhealthy family system. Mm-hmm. And that's extremely important to take into consideration when we think about the system that is connected to the young man or woman in treatment. And going just back to trauma really quick, a man being able to admit trauma and admit to trauma, what it requires a man to really challenge those rules for being a man, because it's supposedly about being weak, mm-hmm. Vulnerable, overpowered, abused, and acknowledging that they were abused, as opposed to just saying, well, I deserved it. I was a bad kid, or I just was a handful, or, that's just how you discipline boys, or, whatever.
Do you talk to them about getting past the past so that they can move on to the future? Because I always feel that if you grasp onto blaming, no matter what your situation was, that you never really truly can recover.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the central tenets of recovery. In fact, it gets old for me, for those people who don't understand recovery, who stand outside of it, who say, oh, well, it's just about them being victims, and they talk about being powerless, and they don't take responsibility. But core to the recovery process, at least the 12-step recovery process, is this idea of saying, you know what, yeah, that's maybe how I grew up, and then maybe I need special help to be able to really process that, particularly if it's locked in my brain and getting in the way of my ability to function. But it doesn't ever become an excuse. Mm-hmm. It may be an explanation, but it can't ever be an excuse, because then you're forever trapped. You're forever tied to that event, that person, that situation, as being responsible for your freedom as well as for your captivity, for lack of a better term. And it's, Denise, it really is such a valuable service. I mean, for you to just be so persistent and consistent in putting that message out there and letting folks know that, there's hope, there's a solution, that, there's the ability to not have to suffer as much, and to understand, to better understand what's happening. I mean, I just think, it's so important when you can begin to get understanding and awareness about a situation. I mean, that's really the first step in being able to take meaningful action